Hello again, and a very warm welcome on behalf of UNDP to all participants of this webinar, and especially to our speakers. Ramadan Kareem to all of you celebrating this holy month. My name is Naja Hashimi. I'm the Regional Electoral Policy Specialist with UNDP's Regional Office for the Arab States. I am based in Amman, Jordan. I'm your moderator for this webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on elections. As we know, the outbreak has affected all aspects of our life, both public and private, all over the world. And elections are no exception. Governments and electoral authorities the world over have been forced to grapple with decisions to either delay or reschedule planned elections or consider alternative voting methods to protect the health and safety of voters and election workers. Thus far, according to IDEA figures, at least 56 countries have postponed elections that were scheduled during this period, while 24 countries have pressed ahead despite concerns related to the pandemic. Every day we are learning how electoral authorities are approaching these decisions and what measures are being put in place to ensure both safety and security of voters, as well as the integrity of the process. In our last two webinars, we shared with you the experiences of Bolivia, Tunisia, the US states of Washington, DC, and Wisconsin. We also had global experts. Today, we bring you yet another excellent high-level panel that will share another diverse set of experiences. We are confident you will find and leave this webinar with greater knowledge and understanding of the complexities of preparing for and holding elections during a pandemic, and hopefully with some practical ideas on what alternative methods can be considered in your own context. Countries that have held elections in the past 3 months have put in place special voting arrangements to reduce the risk of spreading the virus. As we hear and learn more from these experiences, we are able to, as a broader election community, identify good practices and recommended measures that can help authorities maintain electoral timelines. One of the first questions being asked of us as election practitioners and experts is what kind of an election is possible during a pandemic? If the traditional way of voting with people coming together at polling centers is a health risk, then what other methods are available? With social distancing in effect and other restrictions that limit movement and gathering, some of the alternative methods that are being considered for elections during the pandemic include postal voting, early voting, proxy voting, mobile voting, and of course we often hear electronic voting, and then a combination of these. Many of you are exploring these options as we speak. Some of you have already used variations of these methods in your recently held elections. The decision of what method or combination of methods to use is very much context specific. What may work in one country may not work in another. In fact, what may work in one region of a country may not work in another. What you may hear from Secretary Padilla on the voting methods in California may not be suitable for many of you. You may, for instance, lack the necessary infrastructure to put in place a statewide mail-in voting process. But these experiences of Mexico, of Georgia, of California will add to our knowledge on how electoral authorities are responding to the pandemic and giving an insight into the decision-making processes and the factors that dictate what voting methods are adopted. Some of the guiding questions to consider before deciding on a change in voting method include: are there existing infrastructures to support the change in the process? Is there adequate time to implement that change? Does the electoral authority have the necessary capacity, either institutionally and individually, to implement the new methods? What are the financial resource implications? Is there sufficient budget? Will the EMB continue to have full ownership of the process, or will they be required to outsource, for instance, to technology firms for solutions? Will the integrity of the process from start to end be compromised with this change? Are there any legal constraints to deciding on an alternative method? Can they be overcome? Is there time to address the legal implications? And then finally, is there a likelihood of broader stakeholder consensus around the new method? Most importantly, does the public and voters have confidence in the new method and the ability of the electoral authority to implement it effectively with full integrity? As we all know, deciding on what method to use does not just affect election day, it can have implications for other phases of the process, including voter registration, results tabulation, issues of staffing, of training, of election observation, and a myriad of other steps in the process. Finally, in times of global pandemic, public trust in government is more critical than ever. And given that there are increasing levels of inherent distrust in political systems, it is essential to ensure that ordinary citizens understand and trust the process. And that the new methods adopted will not only prevent the spread of the virus, but it will ensure the integrity of the vote and its outcome. These are the issues to be discussed today. We as UNDP hope you will find them useful. This is our third webinar, and we plan to bring you these every 2 weeks. We encourage you to interact with the panel and each other via the chat box by sharing your comments, questions, and suggestions for future webinars. This is the best we can do in these difficult times, so let's make it as interactive as possible. I see a very large turnout. We have colleagues here from as far away as Bolivia. We have, of course, Mexico. We have the US. We have Afghanistan. We have countries represented from the Arab states region. We have colleagues all over the world interested to hear these experiences. Before I introduce the panel, let me get a few housekeeping issues out of the way. Each of our speakers will have 10 minutes to speak. Then we'll go into a 45-minute Q&A. And then I'll ask the speakers to do a closing in 2 minutes. I may throw in some last-minute questions that were not addressed to the speakers at that point. Again, as I said, we are in Ramadan, so we'll try to finish up as quickly as possible within the 90 minutes. Please write your questions throughout the session in the chat box, even though we will have the Q&A later on. Again, to the people who joined us, Spanish and Arabic interpretation is available. Osama, Nicholas, would you like to one more time explain it? How they can access it, since we've had a large number of people join since the last time.
مرحبا جميعا للأصدقاء العرب اللي لسه انضموا لنا. بشكل سريع لتفعيل الترجمة العربية مثل ما خبرناك، واحنا بنوفر الترجمة العربية والإسبانية كونه الأغلب العروض تكون موفرة باللغة الإنجليزية، فلهيك احنا بنترجمها للغة العربية بشكل فوري واللغة الإسبانية. إذا بتحبوا تسمعوا اللغة العربية رح تلاقوا بالأسفل كلمة interpretation، الآيكون موجود بشبه الكرة الأرضية مثل ما موجود بالصورة أو البرزنتيشن الموجود هون. لما تضغطوا عليها رح تطلع منيو صغيرة فيها off English, Japanese, Spanish وميوت Original Audio. اختاروا Japanese، اختاروا القناة اليابانية لتكونوا قادرين على سماع الترجمة العربية. يرجى الضغط برضو على ميوت اوريجينال اوديو حتى ما يصير في لخبطه ما بين الصوت الاصلي للمتحدث وصوت الترجمه. اذا بتفضلوا بس تسمعوا صوت الترجمه. Over to you, Nicholas.
Thank you very much, Osama. Good morning to everyone who's joining us from all over the world. Buenos días a todos los que se unen a este webinar de todas partes del mundo, pero por sobre todo a las personas que vienen de países hispanohablantes. Bueno, para poder habilitar la opción de la traducción simultánea, tienen que dirigirse hacia el panel de control que se ubica generalmente en la parte inferior de sus pantallas y hacer clic o pinchar en el icono que dice interpretación. Este icono se parece más o menos al del mundo y es el que está señalado en el punto número 1 de la diapositiva. Después, seleccionen por favor el idioma que sea de su preferencia. Naturalmente esperamos que sea español y preferiblemente sería mejor que pudiesen silenciar el audio original. Esto se lo hace yendo o haciendo clic en la opción debajo de los idiomas disponibles para que de esta forma puedan escuchar al traductor simultáneo únicamente y no existan confusiones con el audio original de los panelistas. Having said that, I'll go over to Nadia so we can start with the webinar. Habiendo dicho eso, podemos comenzar con el webinar, que esperamos que sea una experiencia enriquecedora para todos. Buenos días.
Thank you so much, Osama and Nicholas. We'll go straight into our panel because I know this is why you're here. We'll start with Secretary Padilla. Thank you once again for joining us from California, where it's 8 a.m. Secretary Padilla is in an elected position. He serves as the officer in California. California, my home state as well, so very happy to have you here. And it also is a state that has a variety of methods utilized across the state. So it'll be very, I think, useful to hear from Secretary Padilla on the various methods and how the COVID pandemic has affected his decision on how to proceed with the November elections coming up. So I will not waste more time. Over to you, Secretary.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And hello, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you may be. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this webinar. And I too hope that everybody participating here is staying safe and healthy and protecting themselves during this pandemic. In the initial invitation, I was asked to give just a little bit of background on sort of democracy in the United States of America. So I'll spend just 1 minute on that and then talk about how we are approaching the November elections in California. But you know, if you go back to the founding documents of the United States, from the Declaration of Independence to our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the first amendments to our Constitution, you'll see some common themes there, not just you know, freedoms and liberties, but balance of power. And when I say balance of power, most people think immediately, well, our three branches of government, from the legislative branch and the executive branch to the judicial branch. But I think most importantly, like in the democracies around the world, it's the balance of power between those who are governed, the people, and their government. And so, as in all democracies, that balance of power is maintained through the vote. The people exercise their power or delegate power or direct power through participation in elections. So elections and the right to vote has been important and critical since the founding of our nation, but clearly they have evolved over time, how people can exercise their right to vote, starting with who's eligible to vote. You know, when the United States was first founded, it was only white male landowners over the age of 25. And I won't go through all the detailed history, but today, everybody in the United States who is 18 years or older and a citizen of the United States, with minimal exceptions, has the right to vote. Now, in our Constitution, the administration of elections is delegated to states. I know in some countries it is federally or nationally driven. In the United States, it's really driven state by state. And so you'll see some differences in how elections are administered, how easy or it isn't to register to vote if you're eligible, or to be able to cast your ballot every election once you're registered to vote. As I think all of you know, this is a big election year in the United States of America. Whether people are very excited or people are scared or happy the direction the country is going or upset about the direction the country is growing, there's a lot of excitement about being able to vote in November for many offices, including the presidency of the United States. Now, before we get to a November general election, we have primary elections that determine the candidates for various positions for individual political parties. So California voted in March of this year in our primary. So it's just before the true impact of the pandemic. And I start with that because going into this year, going into our March primary election, we had record registration in California, more voters registered than at any other point in our history, both by numbers and the number of eligible voters registered. And I think it's because of the various policies we put in place to make it easier for eligible people to register to vote. Once upon a time, you had to do it only on paper. And years ago, we created the online voter registration opportunity. We now have also automatic voter registration for people when they are applying for or renewing their driver's license or their state ID, and other means. But I mentioned that because to vote, you have to be registered, and in this COVID-19 environment, there's no safer, physically distinct way to register to vote than to do it online, whether you're registering to vote for the first time or updating your voter registration. So that has been very helpful. How we vote. In recent years, California has been on the forefront nationally on increasing opportunities for registered voters to actually cast their ballot. When we vote, once upon a time, you had to show up on election day to be able to the county courthouse specifically. And over time, as populations grew, population centers grew, we started expanding the number of locations that people went to go vote, but you had historically been limited to one designated location. In recent years, we've done two things: both increase the flexibility of in-person voting, either more days or more locations or both for any individual voter, but we've also been expanding vote by mail. Now, vote by mail is a hot topic these days in the United States. Is it good? Is it not good? I think it's good. Should it be easy? Should it be limited? The history of vote by mail in the United States of America, this is a little bit of history for everybody, dates back to our Civil War. In the time of Lincoln, when soldiers were leaving their homes to fight for the Union mostly, but also some fighting for the Confederacy, and wanting to still be able to cast their ballot in important elections while they were completing their service. So voting by mail in the United States is nothing new, but those are the origins. In the course of the evolution of vote by mail, we've gone from limited vote by mail for only certain excuses to what we call no excuse vote by mail. Anybody who just as a preference can sign up to do that, but it was one election at a time. We now have a classification of permanent vote by mail in California, where you can let your elections officials know that you just want to receive your ballot in the mail every election, and it comes automatically. And now, as in the state of Washington, the state of Oregon, or others, we're moving in the direction of universal vote by mail, where just as a matter of policy, every registered voter will automatically receive their ballot in the mail in advance of the election. But let's not mistake this for an all vote by mail only model. There's some states that 99% of the people will receive their ballot in the mail and return their ballot in the mail. In California, we believe it's important to maintain in-person voting opportunities, both on election day and before election day, for people who need assistance, whether it's language assistance. Yes, we're very diverse, not just as a country, but especially California. Maybe people of different physical abilities needing to access different types of voting systems to be able to vote privately, independently. We used to have a deadline weeks before the election to register to vote to be eligible, but now you can present yourself in person all the way through election day and still be able to register and cast your ballot. Obviously, in-person voting opportunities are necessary to be able to continue to maintain those. So we've been doing this even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And now, given the challenges of what we're living through, these policies make even more sense because our task is still there. We have a general election in November. It's not a matter of if we will be voting in November. It's not a matter of when we will be voting in November. There's some who suggest maybe we should postpone or cancel the election. Some states have rescheduled their primary elections. We cannot change the November general election. That date, that timeline is written into our Constitution. The question is how we can administer an election that is accessible, that is secure, because foreign interference and cyber threats, all those things continue to be concerns. But now on top of all that, how do we administer elections that are safe for everybody, for voters, for elections administrators, for poll workers, etc. And so again, registering by online, vote by mail, I think are going to be a big help in that regard. But new protocols and procedures to integrate into the in-person voting experience are going to be key. And so we've been working not just with our state and local public health officials, but through the National Association of Secretaries of State. So my colleagues from around the country and I are members of an organization where we share ideas, best practices, and innovations to continually improve elections. We've actually facilitated conversations with elections officials from Israel, most recently, who had elections at the outset of this pandemic, and we have a webinar coming up with representatives of South Korea. Those two countries have had elections in recent weeks during this COVID-19 pandemic, and so we're hoping to learn from each other what kind of measures we can put in place in physical voting locations to keep access to our elections open, but also keep people safe from a health perspective. So we're working together now, not just to increase registration and produce ballots and all elections materials, but to procure face masks and gloves and hand sanitizer and all the personal protective equipment necessary to keep everybody safe. So that's a very high overview of what we have going on. So I look forward to hearing from the other panelists and to answering your questions. Before I turn it back over, unas breves palabras en español para mis colegas que están participando de los países latinoamericanos. Sí, también en los Estados Unidos somos muy bilingües. Gracias por la invitación de participar en este evento y les deseo mucha suerte, no solo en sus papeles desarrollando las elecciones este año y en el futuro, pero que se estén cuidando para mantenernos saludables y seguir contribuyendo y sirviendo. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you, gracias, Secretary Padilla. I think there's a lot to learn from, and there's so much more we can dig into on the experiences of California. But you touched on something that's important, which is having the culture of a certain method and going back to the history. So it was a learning point for me as well, that the mail-in voting goes back a long ways. And there are challenges that you're facing that many other countries are facing. And it's really great to hear that you are open and learning from the experiences of other countries. Yes. We often look at the US as sort of a model on so many things, but there's a lot the US can learn from other countries as well. So I like that you highlighted this point. I'd like to go to our second panelist. But before I do, again, I'll say we have a great turnout from around the world. We have about 300 people here. We also have people following us on Facebook and on other platforms. You're being live streamed. Welcoming colleagues from all over. Now I was going to say to please go ahead and put your comments, your questions in the chat box. We'll get to it during the Q&A. Chairperson Zvania, welcome. It's fantastic to have you. It's great to see you again. I know the pandemic has also affected you as you prepare for elections in Georgia. I know that you faced, in my guiding questions, one of the points I raised was on the legal basis for having a change of methods. And I think the experience of Georgia will speak to the challenges of changing a method in a short period of time, and how the legal framework may not allow it. And in cases like that, how do you proceed and how do you make preparations for an election? And I think we'll learn a lot from Chairperson herself. Over to you, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Nadia. This is great pleasure, dear colleagues, dear participants. It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all at this very important platform of discussion. I'm very glad that UNDP took this essential initiative and decided to moderate our gathering during this very challenging and unprecedented time. Exchanging our visions and plans in terms of operating in times of pandemic becomes essential for each of us, EMBs and organizations working in the election field. Some of the countries opted to postpone holding elections processes, but those who decided to follow their electoral schedule are an important source of information for the rest of us. Their experience needs to be widely shared, and we need to intensify our cooperation as it becomes vital to have consultations and jointly address new emerging challenges. Elections and democracy face major challenges in terms of two main contexts, political and procedural. We, EMBs, as mostly politically neutral bodies, need to deliberate over the procedural issues at first and introduce carefully considered and sought out practical modifications and instructions to our election procedures. As you might be already aware, we have scheduled parliamentary elections in Georgia to be held in October this year. In terms of upcoming elections, the highest tension falls over the political process and over the scheduled reform of election system. Recently, the political agreement to change the electoral system has been reached, and the relevant constitutional amendments are under debate in the parliament. It is anticipated that at the end of July, the legislative body will vote on new constitutional amendment, which will introduce more proportional election system with less MPs elected on single constituency mandate. Consequently, a plenty of subsequent procedural and legislative changes will follow, including amendments to the Election Code of Georgia. It should be mentioned that a specially established working group on electoral reform has been operating for months to elaborate the package of amendments, which will improve, of course, election code and ensure its compliance with the OSCE ODIHR most recent recommendations. Main challenge for the CEC Georgia is to be ready in October to conduct elections according to the new electoral system, ensure smooth introduction of new procedures if such necessity emerges, and at the same time respond to the challenges related to the spread of the new coronavirus. At this stage, CEC took several preventive measures in response to pandemic situation. We have postponed various large-scale events, including, for instance, 10th EMB meeting, which is an international annual meeting conducted annually. Now our EMB works under the special regulations with most of the employees actually working remotely. Meetings, trainings, courses, and various important activities are being conducted remotely. It should be underlined that the measures taken to prevent the spread of the coronavirus at this stage did not considerably damage the implementation of the duties of election administration prescribed by law. It is often discussed that in times of pandemic, introducing e-voting procedures may serve as a solution and prevent the spread of the virus during a day. Those operating in the field of elections are very well aware that this process is rather complicated, disputable in terms of security, safety, and encounters plenty of procedural and political processes. Reaching political consensus over a voting or other alternative voting methods, as well as ensuring the relevant level of public confidence in this process, used to be challenging even in previous years in Georgia. Rushing all these comprehensive procedures cannot be an absolute solution for the pandemic situation. It should be underlined that the political actors in Georgia do not even discuss the possibility to amend or change the voting procedure. None of the initiative or desire to introduce relevant voting methods have been discussed and expressed yet. However, I'm very glad that during the past several years, the CEC Georgia has always been very keen to introduce election technologies for as many election processes as possible. Developing and introducing innovative procedures with the engagement of new technologies was and remains to be one of our main strategic pillar in strategic plan of the election administration. Accordingly, we have online registration platform for almost all election stakeholders. During elections, political parties, local and international observer organizations, as well as media organizations register their representatives and observers through online form, which in total actually counts around 100,000 persons registration online. All the required documentations are being submitted through electronic program, and the obligations to submit hard copies have been replaced with online solution. The CEC webpage and the specially designed application also allows the voters to verify their data in the voters list online using different gadgets and allowing them to avoid personal contact with election precincts for this purpose. Here, I should mention that the CEC has been working to engage technologies in the voting procedures as well. During past two by-elections, the CEC Georgia, in cooperation with the Canadian International Non-Governmental Organization, implemented two pilot projects on introducing vote counting machines, which aimed at simplification of counting procedures at the election precinct and reducing the time for vote tabulation at the precinct level. The pilots actually were successful, and without rushing, the CEC is planning to gradually expand this process and pilot more technologies in elections to support informed political discussion over the possibilities for introducing technologies. At this stage, what we do, we are working to develop a plan for voting process in line with the acting legislation, which will be practiced on a day without substantially changing the polling procedure. The election administration will prepare through considering all of the already experienced procedures and be ready to introduce new sanitary norms with relevant required equipment such as, for instance, sanitizers, face masks, gloves, etc. The CEC already developed an anticipated purchase plan for the required equipment and considered need for relevant financial resources. We will elaborate relevant rule for ensuring so-called social physical distancing and envisage each of every particular regulation which was practiced by other countries and EMPs who already conducted elections. We will be organizing wide discussions with the engagement of all electoral stakeholders, including political parties, civil society, local and international organizations. For this purpose, the CEC will use all of those cooperation platforms with election stakeholders and civil society that we have established previously. It is important to note that other election procedures which require personal contact with electoral stakeholders may also be substituted by online services. For example, submitting documentation for the announced competition, which is very high number of the applications we receive at the election administration at the precinct level, can be ensured in distance through electronic forms. Registration of candidates lists as well as candidates themselves, registration of disputes can be moved in electronic format through online programs. Some new changes require legislative amendments as a provisional article in the Election Code of Georgia. It is already a approved case and was practiced by CEC when we introduced online registration program. Therefore, CEC is looking for more possibilities to engage additional online solutions for even more election processes. In the end, I would say that we, like all other EMBs who still have elections ahead, we carefully monitor all electoral processes that take place around the world. platforms of discussion similar to our today's webinar gain essential role, and I hope you all will be very active to have a fruitful discussion, and I'm looking forward to intensifying our collaboration with each of you, which will give us the possibility to effectively deal with the new crisis. Thank you very much for your kind attentions.
Thank you so much, Chairperson. It was fantastic to hear the very methodical approach you are taking to the introduction of technology. We often are very cautious when we hear technology in elections, but ensuring that there are pilots and that you have methods and steps to follow is important. And I particularly appreciate that you're following sort of a consultative process, engaging with stakeholders, having the dialogue that really is essential. So it's great to see that from Georgia. There are questions coming in and we'll bring that back to you, but I will now go to our third speaker, President Cordova. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that you had another meeting before this, but we are happy that you made the time to be here. I know that your colleagues in the audience from Mexico are in large numbers. They're excited to hear you, just as the rest of us are. INE is known around the world as one of the strongest electoral bodies, and they often, give us great ideas and good practices that we can share as the UN with the rest of the world. So we want to thank you for that, and we want to congratulate you, and I'll give you 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Nadia. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think it's very important to share experiences because, in the future, elections, everything will change after this pandemic. And as you said in the introduction, elections are not the exception. Thank you so much also to the opportunity to share this virtual panel with Jvania and Alex. Is very pleased to see them and see them well, as well as many other friends as Rafael. I saw Rafael in one of the, the views of the complete panel. I mean, it's very important for us to share Mexican experience from one departing point of view. There are no a unique solution to face the challenges that the pandemic is planted into democracy and into elections. So to share experiences and improve some different way to solve them, to solve these problems, to face these problems is fundamental in the times to come. Unfortunately, democracy before the COVID pandemic was not going through its best times. I mean, we already been discussing in the last years some of the challenges that democracies around the world are facing. And it's not a problem of new democracies, but right now those problems are problems that affect the whole democratic context, even in old democracies and new democracies, such as fake news, such as the raising of populism, such as the, distrust in face to institutions, democratic institutions, and so on. Right now we have another problem, which is not just a theoretical problem, but is a very concrete problem. How we will run elections in the post-COVID scenarios. So I'm not intent to give solutions. I will just share in the few minutes I will have in front of how in Mexico INE is facing these new challenges, taking in account that since former IFE was transformed into a national authority, and we are responsible not just to run federal elections. You must remember Mexico is a federal country, but we're also involved in the organization of local elections. I don't know if it's convenient to share a very brief presentation. I've just I prepared a presentation, and Nadia, if you allow me, I will send it to you so you can put it on the webpage of the UNDP or so on, to share it with the audience.
Fantastic.
Okay, so can you see the presentation? Yeah, okay, I will. Well, Mexico, as I said, it's a federal country. In the last 5 years, the former federal electoral authority transformed into a national authority, has become a sort kind of provost authority in the electoral system. So we are not just responsible to run exclusively federal elections, but we also are responsible to conduct the local elections. Even if there are some local EMBs. I mean, each state has an EMB, but they must work under the criteria, the rules, and the supervision of the national electoral body, the National Instituto Nacional Electoral. We are also responsible not just of running elections. We are a permanent authority which has in charge, for instance, the issuing of the electoral voting card, which has actually become the national and the main ID identification. So the decisions we're taking right now in the middle of pandemic not just affect the organization and the running of elections, but also some other powers that INE has to and services, public services that INE has to give up to the people, such as ID. Right now, we are facing two electoral challenges. One immediate in this year, and the other in the next year, when we will hold the largest election ever in Mexico. Right now, in 2019, we should have next June the 7th, I mean in a couple of weeks, elections in two states, the state of Coahuila and the state of Hidalgo. There are local elections, in one case to elect the local parliament, and in the other case, the municipalities. Unfortunately, we had to postpone elections. It's very important to underline that we have postponed that election and not canceled that elections. I mean, in the way to build trustability, I think the EMBs has a very large pedagogical responsibility. So it's very important the words we are using to communicate, what is going on and which one are our decisions. I mean, to say that an election is canceled, allocate democracies, I mean, in a very critical situation, because democracies are not just elections, but the basis of any democracy is precisely elections. So it's very important, I would underline, the key codes we use to communicate what are we doing. But the main challenge, of course, will be the 2021 elections, in which we will renew the Chamber of Deputies, the lower chamber, the 500 members of the local chamber, but we also will have the largest election because of not just the potential voters. We will have, we estimate we will have 96 million of potential voters, which means 6 more millions that in 2018 elections, the presidential, the last presidential election. But we also will face the largest election because the number of public elected seats that will be on dispute. We are talking practically the half of the governorships of the country. We are talking that practically in all the country, except in 2 states, we will renew the local congresses, the local parliaments, and practically every municipality which is elected. You must remember that we have almost 500 municipalities in which the authorities are elected by uses and customs, no? But in practically the rest of the municipalities, there will be a change of government. As I said, we had to take the decision to postpone. We are right now in the peak of the curve of the pandemic, so it will be impossible to run elections in next July. Those 2 states, we had to take the decision to postpone elections. We hope that we will be able to run elections, to reinitiate all the terms that was suspended by the INE in the next few months. And hopefully run the election day before the macro election, the 2021 macro election will start. which by law should initiate next September. But that's a decision that does not depend from INE. It depends in many ways on what health authorities say to us. Right now, we suspended the issuing of the ID card, but we improved an electronic ID card. I mean, right now you can get a certificate, you can download online a certificate that substitute temporarily, you know, the ID card, such as an identification method. Just to say that we as an EMB have not just to worry about election procedures, but also another rights that we guarantee, such as identity right. For the future elections, we are working in several ways. I mean, by law, we have a presidential voting procedure. I mean, that's what's established in the law. But also the law allowed us to improve some different votation systems, such as e-voting procedures. We decided, and I think in the introduction, Nadia, you said, I mean, the main problem we're facing on, which is how to build trustability, no, in face of the new way to run elections in the future after the pandemic. Fortunately, no, Mexican electoral system, instead of what happened, for instance, in the United States or in some developed democracies around the world, Mexican electoral system has been built to inoculate distrust. I mean, the basis of our system, our electoral system, is how to fight against distrust. The problem another democracies has is, I mean, that their electoral systems are built on trust. That's why when someone claims a fraud, they have a huge problem down there. I mean, and that's something that helps us, such as, you know, a history behind us to improve new technologies, for instance. We will run in these 2 local elections in these years, a program to introduce for the first time in a binding way the use of electronic ballot boxes. No, not the whole elections will not the whole election will be received. I mean, the votation will be received in an electronic way, but we will improve, you know, partially, assuming that the trust building process is a gradual process. So we have to face, you know, this challenge step by step. So in this year, we will introduce for the first time, as I said, in a binding way, the use of an electronic ballots. For the next year, and this was something we had already planned before the pandemic, COVID pandemics, we will have some votation from abroad. As Alex well knows, we have one of the largest diaspora of Mexico abroad the country. No, we estimate that there are 12 million Mexicans living abroad. 1.5 million of them have already their registration, so they can vote in the next elections. In the next year's elections, 10 states recognize the votation from abroad, and we decided to implement an e-voting through internet. I mean, right until now, the votation from abroad was a postal votation, but in 2021, for the first time, we will improve the possibility that the Mexican people living abroad could vote in those 10 states through internet. So just to approaching to the closure of my intervention, what we are planning in the future, and I think it was what Alex has just said, also Svania in their presentations, what EMBs are forced and compelled to do in the future is to improve not just, of course, during, you know, the votation, the elections day, many decisions, health conditions in the votation centers, in the polling stations, of course, but also to improve several different ways that should be improved simultaneously, probably to achieve, you know, successful elections in the post-pandemic era, such as using a combined postal voting, not just for abroad. I mean, for us, it's a chance, an opportunity to experiment. I mean, to have the chance to improve this kind of votation in 2021, but with the expectation, maybe in the near future, to extend that possibilities even for the citizens who live in the country, you know. So very probably the next the elections in the future will be partially with presential voting, partially with e-voting in several ways. I mean, electronic ballots on one hand, or e-voting on the other hand, but with one, I assume, one premise. We cannot transform radically our electoral systems, because we will face eventually, if we do that, a lack of trustability. And we can lose trying to face the new era, the new post-pandemic elections era, into a failure of democracy. And these are not times, I end as I started, these are not times to play with democracy. I mean, we're facing several challenges. We cannot forget that those problems are still there. We have to deal with them, but right now we have to face another problem, which is precisely the aim of this webinar. So Nadia, I appreciate so much, again, the opportunity to share with this time with you. And of course, I'm very, I attend the questions eventually that we raise. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you, President Cordova, again demonstrating how strong INE is as an EMB. You know, we've heard some innovative ideas there with the electronic ballot box in particular. It'd be great if your colleagues on this webinar can elaborate a little bit more in the chat box on what that is, how it works. I think you spoke on the institution being established as a mechanism to ensure trust in the process. I think that probably puts a lot of pressure on you now to maintain that during the pandemic. There are several questions on that point I will get to now. Speakers, if you allow, I will delegate the questions to you individually. I have questions for Secretary Padilla first, and then to Chairperson Tamar, and then to President Cordova. To Secretary Padilla, good to have you back on video. The question essentially is on protocols. I throw that to you because you are one state within a big country. Are there protocols nationally developed for you, whether it's from health agencies or from your federal bodies? Are there protocols, and how are you working to meet them?
So I think the question is somewhere in between a yes and a no. Over the course of our history, we've held elections, and people have turned out to vote in different circumstances, times of peace, times of war, good economic times, economic recessions, and even in prior flu pandemics. A lot of people remember or through history, the flu pandemic of 1918. Even then, we did not reschedule our elections. We had to make accommodations for how to vote during that time. But because health pandemics are not impacting elections every single cycle, there's not a playbook or a set of rules of how to administer the election. When we confront a situation like this, of course, the logical thing to do is for elections administrators to coordinate with public health officials. And so that's what's happening. We've started in California at a state level, but we'll develop local plans based on different risks and circumstances in each region. California is made up of 58 counties, and each county has their elections administrator, which we help oversee, and each county has their local public health officers. So we're coordinating the conversations to determine the proper protocols and measures to adopt. But as part of doing that is not just learning, internally, but reaching out to other states. What are they doing? I mentioned California voted early in March in our primary. Other states have yet to have their primary elections, and they're coming up in the next couple of weeks. Some people might have seen the images from the state of Wisconsin, who instead of postponing their primary elections decided to go forward in the midst of this pandemic outbreak, if you will. And so different states have tried to test different protocols, and we're constantly learning both domestically and, as I mentioned earlier, internationally. So a long way of saying there's no set playbook. We're learning in real time, but we're learning and we want to keep learning as much as possible. Nadia, I'm going to excuse myself for about 10 minutes to attend to another call, but I will rejoin in about 10 to 15 minutes for some more questions.
Thank you, Secretary Padilla. We'll save your questions for you.
Okay, thank you.
Chairperson Banya, if I can, I'll throw the next question to you. The question is on if you can elaborate more on how you maintain communications with election stakeholders, especially political parties and civil society organizations, and how frequently do you have those communications?
Thank you for this question. This is really great question, and this is not easy really to maintain the communication and good cooperation with especially political parties and civil society groups. But we have very good practice in this regard, and it's already several years we have established special formats for discussion, and we have established special working groups involving civil society organizations. For instance, we have created special format named as a Discuss Together, and we invite all civil society organizations, and these meetings are, the frequency of the meetings are monthly meetings. So we invite all of them and we discuss the recommendations provided by international organizations, the current challenges and needs in the election process, etc., etc. And this kind of discussion is very, very important. And almost about 30 NGOs, non-governmental organizations working in electoral field, they are part of this discussion platform. This is how we communicate all current activities, also needs and challenges with civil society. We discuss together all the challenges and we find the solutions together. Another platform what we have and we created, it was about 5 years ago. This is the special working groups together with civil society organizations and different governmental agencies. Some governmental agencies are also involved in these groups. We have 2 different groups working. One group working on ethnic language minority issues, how they will be involved in the elections just to ensure inclusive electoral process. And the second group, what we have also, this is the group working on the issues working on persons with disabilities. And we discuss together all the possibilities, all the needs, and even most recently we developed and updated new manual for as an instruction how to communicate during the election process with persons with disabilities. And the NGOs and civil society groups, they provide their feedback, their contribution to this kind of instructions and manuals, and we jointly elaborate this kind of instructions. And this is a very good option actually, and the experience what we have together with civil society groups, and we actually discuss all necessary information and the challenges what we have in place with regard to election processes. One important point also, if I may, this is also joint code of conduct we elaborate together with civil society groups, and this is the code of conduct of Central Election Commission, of Election Administration of Georgia, and also civil society organizations working in election field. And we, every year we work on this code of conduct. We amend, update it based on the existing needs and the new challenges, and we sign this code of conduct how we behavior during active election period. And this is very important working process as well. When it comes to political parties, it is a bit difficult and more challenging really to involve all of them in the discussion, but usually we have lots of interesting topics and discussions together with political parties. And during active election period and even before, we sometimes monthly basis, sometimes less, maybe by monthly basis, we invite political parties and we update them about the ongoing electoral activities, ongoing issues, and we also receive their questions and demands, what they want to receive from election administration. And this is like the working format which we use actively in active election time period. However, we also train, we offer political parties to train their representatives, and in every election year we train the proxies of political parties on procedural issues, and we also train the lawyers of political parties just to ensure the uniform understanding of electoral processes. That's how we avoid misunderstanding or some implications for the complications in the procedural issues. That is experience what we have, and I really suggest all EMBs to create discussion platforms, some kind of format working groups, which is very good practice of election administration of Georgia. Thank you for this question.
Thank you. Can I just follow up quickly on what has been the reaction of political parties and others to having the candidacy and observation online?
Can you repeat the question? I did not get your question.
Yeah, is it a positive reaction you're receiving from political parties and other stakeholders on shifting to online candidacy and observation systems?
Yeah, this is a very good question, because when we first piloted this online registration platform, we of course wanted to hear their feedback, and we developed special questionnaire for all political parties, and almost 26 political parties, they take part in this online registration process in the pilot, in the first pilot, and in the next time as well. And all of them, 26 political parties, they evaluated positively this online registration platform. Of course, this is a very good positive aspect of our cooperation.
Thank you very much. I'll go to you, President Cordova. I think you've been following the chats. There's a particular question on what polling machines will be used in Mexico, where are they made? There's also a question on how can you ensure trust in the process? Are you taking any additional measures? And then if I can also ask you to speak on a question that involves how are you getting a sense of what the public feels about going to the polls during these times? Are you doing any surveys? How are you assessing sort of the perceptions of the public on having elections in a pandemic?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would thank all the questions on the chat. There are plenty of them. I was trying right now to answer some of them. I mean, through the chat, but I mean I had no time. So I will try to resume the answers. First, a general reflection about voting machines, electronic voting machines. There are plenty of kinds of voting machines around the world. Some of them were very successful, some has less success, and so on. But I mean, I would say that in Mexico we will use locally produced electronic machines. In the local level, there is a lot of experience on that. This is the first time in this new national system we will use them. But I would say there are some standards, some criteria worldwide established on what an e-voting machine should have. First of all, it should be auditable. I mean, not just, you know, the systems, but also, you know, the functioning, the mechanical functioning of the voting machine should be auditable, not just before the elections, but also after elections, which is very important in the building of trust around, you know, the election results. In second place, to become auditable, I mean, the electronic machines should print. That's a good practice around the world. I mean, right now, for instance, in Brazil, in which they have been used successfully for almost 20 years, e-voting machines. Right now, they have the problem because their e-voting machine do not print, you know, a testimony of the vote. So right now, they're improving this criteria, the new criteria, which, as I said, is a good practice. I mean, this is a result of good practices around the world. On second place, I would like to say something, because I just saw one question which is very important. I mean, should the elections should be postponed by pandemics? I mean, I would say, as Alex, the Secretary of State of California, Secretary of State said, I mean, in first instance, the answer should be no. But we cannot put in contradiction two fundamental rights, which is, you know, the political rights to elect our authorities on one hand, and the right of health. So we have to do an interpretation. If you can combine, if you can guarantee both rights, so the answer is no, do not postpone an election. But such as I said, it happened in Mexico. I mean, we should have elections in those two states in 2 weeks, and right now we are in the point of the pandemic curve. So to run elections right now, no matter what happens, and by the way, just a case that we have followed. I mean, the Friends of the Dominican Republic, they should run elections in a couple of months. We're talking about presidential elections, and we're facing a huge problems, by the way, you know. But I mean, if we can save both rights, so do not move elections. But if running an election could have the problem, I mean, the possibility to put in risk the health fundamental right, it won't be a good decision to maintain an election, even in the logic to you know, build trustability and confidence around democracy itself. I mean, we cannot put democracy against the health right. So if you have to postpone it, you must postpone it. But just if you have to do that. Obviously, for the next year election, we are planning not to move them, hoping, I mean, the health conditions in 2021 would allow us to run elections. There was one question about, you know, the internet and the access to internet as a way to avoid, I mean, as a problem, you know, to make voting right eventually a discrimination, because there are many people who has not access to, you know, technologies and internet connection. That's why I was saying that the elections in the future will not. I mean, it's impossible to think elections in the actual conditions, because the world is changing. I mean, the pandemic is putting us in a condition to improve and to rethink elections. But that could not be the justification to mandate one of the fundamental principles of elections, which is equal vote and the guarantee of a voting right for everybody. So that's why in the future, I think we should combine different ways of voting. In a huge society, I mean, you must think in next year, if nothing changes, we should install more than 166,000 polling stations around the country. So to allow 96 million of potential voters to do that. On just one day, we will become, the polling stations, contagious centers. So what to do? Evidently, we cannot ask everybody to vote through internet because many people have not access to those technologies. So we had to guarantee the possibility today to vote, maybe in manually situation, but to avoid crowds on the polling stations, maybe that's why I think we should introduce and combine different votation systems. Some of them could vote anticipatively by posted way. Some of them could vote by electronic ways, and some of them, to guarantee their right to vote, should vote presentially. And obviously, it's very important to follow what happened a couple of weeks ago elections in South Korea, because they improved. That's the first election in the pandemic era. So they improved a lot of mechanisms, a sanitary mechanism in the votation centers. They multiply the polling stations so the people would not crowd in just one place. They warranty sanitary measures, to clean after every elector voted, the polling station, and so on. In Mexico, for instance, I just saw one of the questions. I'm afraid there are many Mexicans attending this webinar, so I'm very pleased of that. In Mexico, for instance, to guarantee that the people could vote just one time, we inked their finger. Right now, we ink it, with a roll-on, probably, and we are right now discussing with the university that produces the ink. We should use improving into spray. So to avoid, the physical contact between the polling station officers and the voters. So I mean, we have to be open to improve new technologies, new ways to vote, and that should, in many ways, implies a change of mind. But once again, and many questions are around, trustability. Building trustability, that's Mexican experience. It's a very long and slow process. We cannot ask people to change, to accept a radical change of the electoral system, of the procedures that they are aware on, that they do well known, for a very different way to face elections, if we do not do at least two things. On one hand, remember that the building of trust is a sort kind of trial error process, and the risk of an error for democracy obliges us to get step by step. I mean, do not run, the Italian says, chi va piano va lontano, no? So take this with some patience, because it will not be a change from the day to the night to the day. I mean, it's not an instantaneous change. And the second thing, you must explain. I do sustain that the role of an EMB is not just do a very precise technical actuation. We must explain, and we should do that before elections took place and not just after. If we try to explain a problem, we are not explaining, we're making a damage control. So to avoid that, EMBs should become a very powerful pedagogical institution. And for that, that's why I think what Svania pointed on is very important. You cannot trust, you cannot build trust alone. You need the help of stakeholders. And obviously, you cannot ask a stakeholder to be, an unconditional ally of an EMB. You must build that confidence. You must put a lot of efforts building that relationships, and you must assume that the process of building trust is a very complex, but it's a process that should demands the co-responsibility of many actors, not just governmental actors, not just public actors, but also stakeholders. If we do that, be patient, but do not stop in the improving measures, and explain a lot. Probably we will rebuild our election systems and make them affordable systems in the post-pandemic democratic era.
Thank you very much, President Cordoba. You're very popular in our chat box. It's really great to see strong turnout from Mexico.
Sorry, Nadia, I'm not popular. There are a lot of Mexicans in here.
Yes, they wanted to hear you. It's great. I think you had some really strong messages on a global level. I think they are valuable to all of us, both as practitioners and as experts providing assistance to electoral authorities. We have less than 10 minutes. I'm going to ask the last of the questions and then ask you, as part of your answers, to sort of do a wrap up in the last takeaways that you have for a global audience, people from all over the world that are really looking for sort of practical ideas and suggestions on how to ensure the integrity of an election if they go forward in a pandemic. I'll go to Chairperson Zvania. The particular question to you is what special measures, if any, the CEC is adopting on political campaigning during COVID-19, and then also ask you to make any other remarks you'd like in 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. This question was raised in the chat. Actually, I provided answer, but I will repeat for everyone that so election administration of Georgia does not have any authority to touch the issue with regard to political campaign, except the violation cases if there are some violations by political actors. So we are obliged to really investigate this violation and offer respective sanction, which is made. Actually, the final decision is made by court, but we actually process with administrative process, and we also create special administrative, which is sanctioning protocol for political parties if they actually violate the political campaign rules. This is only what we can do, and of course this is important that political parties, they also have access to the political campaign. And maybe as a final note, I will say that whatever methods are used in election processes, so it does not matter if we do not inform properly respective stakeholders, if we do not inform properly voters, and the most important is to have a participatory discussion over any modification in electoral processes or instructions, and also to involve, of course, involve political parties, other electoral stakeholders, the international community in this discussion, use the best practices applied throughout the world, but also the another and most important, I would say, is just a uniform understanding of all these processes and procedures which will be which will apply in any electoral processes. So, and I think it is important that whatever changes we made and whatever new modifications we will have because of the pandemic situation. We need to inform stakeholders, we need to properly inform voters, and also we need to ensure that voters, they have safe environment, healthy environment, and they will be safe if in case they come to vote in the polling station. So that's our major obligation, I would say, and we need to work not to really damage voter participation in pandemic situation. That's, I think, my last and very important note.
Indeed, it's very important. Thank you very much for highlighting that once again. I want to, because I've been forgetting in the last two webinars to thank our interpreters. So I want to take this moment quickly to thank them. They've been doing an amazing job to make sure that your messages are heard around the world. And I know that they will be leaving very soon. I will go to Secretary Padilla and ask you a question on security, especially which relates to how you are incorporating technology in the different processes, and also how you are ensuring control in the chain of steps when you are expanding to mail-in voting. How will you ensure the security of the ballot and of other sensitive materials? You could speak a bit to that, and then some closing remarks you want to make to the global audience. We have now still around 300 people, but you are also live on Facebook. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. And so let me speak first to vote by mail ballots, and then to the in-person voting experience from a security standpoint. And I also want to touch on the voter education, voter information priority as well. So with growing, the trend for more people choosing to vote by mail was happening before COVID-19, now I think accelerated because of the pandemic. And so among the security measures that we have in place are a signature verification. Voters who choose to vote by mail, they receive their ballot materials. When they complete their ballot, they put it back into a designated envelope, and they have to sign the envelope, seal the envelope. When those ballots return to the county elections offices, one of the first things that's done is the signature on the envelope is compared to the signature from that voter's voter registration record to make sure that it matches, to make sure that the ballot was returned by the voter. Another measure that we are quickly growing in California is of what we call ballot tracking. We have an initiative called Where's My Ballot? A voter can subscribe to receive alerts via text message, via phone call, or via email of where the ballot is in the delivery process from the county to the voter, and then from the voter back to the county, kind of like tracking a package, and also to receive an alert when the ballot was received by the county and processed and counted, all for public confidence in knowing that their ballot is accounted for. So there's additional measures, but those are some of the bigger ones for vote by mail. For in-person voting, this is a question I got a lot during the last several years. How do we know our voting systems are secure? So California has a pretty comprehensive security standard when it comes to voting systems. All the equipment that we use for marking a ballot or casting a ballot or counting ballots have to be tested and certified by the state first. And we have even higher security standards for voting systems to meet than our federal agencies recommend. Our voting systems, for example, require paper ballots. So whether you vote by mail or vote in person, when you cast a ballot, we're casting a piece of paper that's used for counting and recounting as necessary. We prohibit our voting systems from being connected to the internet. Everything has to be offline. So we make it impossible to systematically hack or rig an election that way. And to be extra sure, every county is required to conduct a post-election audit after every election, taking a percentage of the ballots and doing a manual count, a hand count, to make sure that the manual count and the machine counts align to ensure the accuracy and the integrity of the results. So a lot more to it than that. We didn't get into encryption or firewall discussions, but know that it's a pretty robust security measures that we have in place for people who vote in person and who vote by mail. And lastly, I wanted to spend just a minute on voter education. We can do all these things for election security. We can do all these things about options for how people can vote, but it's limited if people are not aware of it. So we do place equal priority on voter education and voter information. I know that came up in the context of a lot of the questions to our colleagues in Mexico, but the more people are familiar with their options and the protections for our election, the more confidence they have in the process itself. So that's equally important and a big task. For us in California, we have the most populous, the largest population, and also the most diverse population. So we communicate different ways in terms of language, different ways in terms of cultural sensitivity, but that's part of our responsibility. And thank you again for having me today.
Thank you very much. As a voter in California, I've been voting out of country since I've been in the UN system, and I've had full confidence. Hopefully, the pandemic does not create any challenges for us there. Thank you again, Secretary Padilla, for being with us and sharing. Please do share, all speakers, if you have more information and a link to where they can find this information with the audience in the chat box. We only have a few minutes. President Lorenzo Cordova, thanks again. I will not give any specific questions to you. I know they're coming in, but because we're running out of time and our audience have to go because of Ramadan, I'll ask you just to do a closing in 2 minutes. But unmute your mic.
No, I'm okay right now. I forgot it. Sorry. You know, that's why, you know, technologies should, as I said, is a trial error process. No, so in the future, this kind of communication ways should be part of normality and not just of exceptionality. I will just finish. I mean, remarking something, underlining something. I'm really worried of. As EMBs, as an international, a multilateral organization such as UNDP, we have an enormous responsibility in these times. As I said, these are not good times for democracy. There are many challenges and accomplished promises that comes even before from the pandemic, of the COVID pandemic. And right now, we have the responsibility to demonstrate that democracy still remains as the best way to solve, you know, and to recreate the enormous plurality of our societies, which I think is not a problem. It's the richness of the democracy. So, even if we are responsible from one of the huge, one part of the huge process which a democracy supposes, the democratic life in a society supposes, which is that minuscule process which is elections. Yes, democracy do not solve just on elections, but democracy depends on free and fair elections. So the responsibility is the one, and I'm talking from Mexico. I know what that means on. If elections became a problem, so democracy is much more in risk than it was before. What we should do now is to guarantee that elections can, and the electoral systems can adapt to the new challenges that the post-pandemic world puts us on. Because that's the best way in which we can sustain democracy and defend democracy from the many challenges they have. Unfortunately, democracy has many other challenges. The pandemic, the sanitary crisis, as we know, will inevitably provoke an economic crisis, and that will suppose more inequality, more poverty, I mean, more problems that democratic governments, elected governments should solve. we cannot make elections one more of those problems, because that will be the best way to, you know, make democracies implode. That's the our generation's responsibility, and that's what, as an UNDP, we should improve. I mean, how to elections could be the basis of you know, the pacific and civilized cohabitation in the modern democracies. That's not enough, but that's essentially. Thank you so much, Nadia. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with Vanya and to share again a panel. And thank you for all the questions, for all the people who assisted this webinar, and all the friends that are here virtually joining today, such as, again, Rafael, which is a very long time friend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. You did a shout out to Rafael twice. It's not fair because I haven't done one. Rafael's our guru. Nice to see you here. Thank you again to all the panel members. I will not do any more closings. I know that it's Azan time for those of you who are celebrating Ramadan. This has been a very informative, very insightful, and hopefully a useful conversation for all of you. And it sets the stage for our next webinar in 2 weeks. Please do follow us on Facebook, on Twitter. The recordings will be available and showcased there. We will share the link as well with those of you who have registered here online. Again, you are available on Facebook, live streaming. The link for that will also be available. Thank you again for joining all over the world. Ramadan Kareem. See you in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.